Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in the Ozark Hills. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In the summer of 1870, in a remote hollow somewhere within the thick ridges of the Ozark region, word began to spread of a strange household that offered more than mere hospitality. The Ozarks, an upland highland region spanning parts of Missouri and Arkansas, were even then a land of sparse settlement, hidden hollows, and communities cautiously clinging to isolation. The rugged terrain and scattered homesteads of the Ozark region made travel slow and records scarce. Wikipedia +1. The property in question stood deep in a narrow valley, accessible only by a narrow dirt trail winding through ridgetops and creeks. The house, known locally as the Gresham Fold, was surrounded by dense woods and hemmed in by steep slopes. Its two residents, sisters Mabel and Clara Gresham, were said to have inherited it from a distant relative, a frontier settler who had first built a modest log cabin, then expanded it over years into a timber-framed dwelling. Local county ledgers describe the Greshams as quietly strange. One entry from 1868 notes that neighbor Isaac Downing, a farmer about 2 miles away, recorded in his journal, "No living voice heard, yet late-night lanterns in the Gresham windows." Another scribbled note in the township clerk's margin remarks, "Their name seldom in public business, always odd hours." The sisters rarely made a journey into the nearest market town, which was a full day's ride over rough roads. By the summer of 1870, rumors had begun to circulate among nearby homesteads. Travelers who accepted meals at the Gresham Fold were never quite the same afterward. Some spoke of cold silences, strange hushed conversations behind closed doors, or of fleeting shadows glimpsed through curtained windows. No formal complaint had yet been lodged, but the tension in the hollow grew palpable. One evening in early July, a drifter named Samuel Reed arrived in the hollow, struggling along the trail, injured and weak. He claimed he had stumbled across the Gresham house seeking shelter. According to a later affidavit, Reed remembered the heavy hush of the forest, the smell of damp wood, and a single glow in the distance. He said, "I asked for water. When I rose from the table, I felt as though I had lost a piece of my mind." He left at dawn, shaken. His recollections would later be referred to in county correspondence and by circuit-riding ministers investigating odd disappearances. In these first stirrings, the case seemed little more than local gossip and unsettled unease. Yet in the months ahead, the Gresham Fold would beckon investigators, marshals, and townsfolk into something darker. By late autumn of 1870, the hollows of the Ozark Hills had begun to quiet under the slow turn of falling leaves. Yet the name Gresham still traveled on whispers between cabins and across creek beds. The small town of Loring's Pass, 10 miles east, saw an uptick in strangers asking for directions to the fold. Peddlers, drovers, and those who fancied themselves investigators. None stayed long. According to fragments of the Carter County record, a local marshal named Elias Wren first visited the Gresham property that November. His journal, preserved in part by the county clerk's office, mentioned 2 women of respectable speech, plain in dress, but not inclined toward open company. He described the kitchen as orderly, yet something about the silence pressed like a hand upon the room. The Gresham sisters, he noted, offered cornbread, beans, and strong coffee. They spoke gently, almost rehearsed. Nothing appeared criminal, but something inhuman in warmth disturbed him. Wren left the property without incident, later reporting that he could not place the cause of my unease, only that the air inside that house did not breathe as it should. Weeks later, however, a report came through of a missing man, Jonas Harrow, a mule trader from southern Missouri. His last confirmed stop was at a creek crossing less than 3 miles from the Gresham Fold. Harrow's belongings were found along the trail, his ledger, a small clasp knife, and a half-empty bottle of laudanum, but no trace of him. Folklore later tied Harrow's disappearance to the Greshams, though records remain inconclusive. The Ozarks, as noted by historians of the region, were already infamous for vanishing travelers and lawless ridges. Even the Ozark Highlands terrain, documented in the 19th century as labyrinthine with hollows deep as graves, was said to swallow men whole without malice or witness. This same landscape, discussed in regional archives, gave rise to both superstition and secrecy. a detail even the later Ozarks historians would remark upon. By early winter, local men began organizing informal watches along the main trail. No formal accusations were made. There was still no body, only silence and unease. It was said that when one passed near the fold, a faint smell of burnt flour drifted from the chimney, though no smoke was seen. A letter from a local minister, Reverend Horace Lyle, written to the circuit superintendent in 1871, described his own attempt to visit the sisters. He wrote, "They were polite, though they did not open their door wide. The elder, Mabel, asked me twice whether anyone else traveled with me. When I replied no, her face changed. It was not fright, it was relief." In early spring of 1871, 2 hunters from Loring's Pass stumbled across disturbed soil not far from the Gresham property. They thought it animal sign, until they noticed what appeared to be a length of fabric buried under the frost. They alerted Marshal Wren, who returned to the fold under heavy rain. That night, according to the same ledgers, was the last entry under his hand. The next day, his horse was found tethered near the creek, saddle still wet, reins broken. When Marshal Elias Wren vanished, the mood in the Ozark Hills turned from suspicion to dread. His horse was returned to the sheriff's post in Loring's Pass, but his saddlebag, soaked through and streaked with mud, held only his journal and a folded scrap of paper with the words, "I heard her singing." County records from that spring describe a hurried inquest led by Deputy Thomas Pelham, a man known more for his superstition than law. Pelham organized a small posse of 6 men, including Reverend Lyle, and rode toward the Gresham fold 2 days after Wren's disappearance. When they arrived, the sisters were gone. The door to the house stood slightly open. Inside, everything was in perfect order. Food still sat on the table untouched. The hearth glowed faintly, but no wood had been added for hours. A journal belonging to the younger sister, Clara, was found inside a trunk near the bed. Its entries were meticulous, written in tight, even script. "We are visited more often now. Mabel says the hill speaks when someone approaches. I hear it too, like the low hum of a millstone. The men who dine never seem to recall the taste of what they've eaten." Pelham's report to the county seat described the discovery of 3 shallow graves behind the property. 2 appeared to have been disturbed by animals. The third, still covered, held the remains of a man matching the general description of Jonas Harrow. His skull showed signs of trauma, though the coroner's notes were careful to avoid speculation. The house itself bore no marks of violence. Only one object stood out, a heavy cast-iron pot filled with brine, inside which floated several bones. A local physician, Dr. Edwin Crowley, later identified them as human in shape, though too discolored for certain identification. The find was quietly recorded in the 1871 circuit ledger, but never publicly reported. Halfway through that same year, the Springfield Republic published a brief column titled "Uneasy Tales from Carter County." It mentioned the vanished sisters of the Ozark Hills and drew comparisons to earlier disappearances across the frontier. One writer later cited the Ozarks region as a land that guards its dead well, echoing the same phrasing used decades later in geographic surveys of the area. The Gresham house was left standing but avoided. Farmers took longer routes to market rather than past the hollow. The county briefly considered burning the structure, but officials claimed ownership was unclear. The deed had been signed in the name of a C.H. Gresham, whose identity could not be verified. Years later, neighbors claimed that under the right moon a pale light flickered behind the windows again. Others swore they saw 2 women walking the trail at dawn, carrying baskets. No one followed. By 1873, the Gresham fold had fallen silent once more, its door blown shut, its well dry, its legend beginning to harden into folklore. By 1874, the story of the Gresham sisters had passed from county ledgers into conversation, trading posts, and the shaded porches of taverns across the Ozark Hills. In the nearby settlement of Reed's Hollow, the case was spoken of in lowered tones, less as a crime, more as a haunting. Men who had helped Marshal Wren were said to have grown quiet and solitary. One was rumored to have moved west. Another took ill and spoke of songs in the hills before his death that winter. The remains found behind the fold were buried in the small cemetery at Loring's Pass, unmarked. Dr. Crowley's medical report was filed, but the pages were curiously incomplete. 3 sheets had been torn out, leaving only fragments of his observations. One note survived in the margins. The marrow appears boiled. The handwriting fades midway through the line. For a time, interest in the case waned. But in 1876, a new discovery rekindled curiosity. A farmhand named Ephraim Dodd uncovered an old trunk while ploughing near the Gresham property's boundary. Inside were ledgers, receipts from traveling merchants, a list of provisions, and a small packet wrapped in oilcloth containing what seemed to be hair braids tied with string. The items were brought to the sheriff's office, but recorded under miscellaneous, as the ownership could not be proven. In a letter written that year by Professor Alden North, an amateur historian who later contributed to regional studies of the Ozarks, he described the case as emblematic of the isolation that shaped frontier life. "These hills conceal more than minerals," he wrote. "They conceal the private ends of humankind." North's paper on the socio-cultural isolation of the Ozark uplands, later summarized in university archives, made passing reference to the Gresham case as an example of post-war estrangement among rural settlers. Local folklore absorbed this academic lens, blurring fact with fear. Stories began to claim that the sisters had not fled but lingered, appearing in the woods during storms, calling to travelers with gentle voices. An old midwife, Agnes Holloway, claimed she once saw two women standing by the well, their clothes dry though the rain poured down. She said, "They weren't spirits, but neither were they breathing." Her statement never reached the court. It lived on only in oral retelling. By 1878, the property had been partially reclaimed by vines and briars. Hunters passing through described the structure as intact, but unsettlingly still. Its windows unbroken and its porch swept clean, as if someone tended it from within. The county's attempt to sell the land failed when bidders withdrew, citing bad luck and a feeling of being watched. In the late 1870s, regional surveyors mapping the southern Ozark boundary noted that the valley surrounding the fold was unusually prone to fog, dense even by highland standards. One remarked in his field notebook, "The air turns colder near the house, though the sun shines above the ridge." Such comments, while scientific in tone, fed the story's second life. By the turn of the decade, what had once been an official case had settled into legend. Yet even then, beneath the quiet of the woods, the story waited to be disturbed again. In the spring of 1881, more than a decade after the Gresham fold had first fallen silent, a new family attempted to settle on the property. They were the Merricks, a couple with 3 children who had come from Arkansas, drawn by the promise of fertile soil and a ready-built house. The deed had passed through several hands before reaching them, none of whom had stayed long enough to clear the land or plant a season's crop. Neighbors tried to dissuade them. Old Ephraim Dodd, now stooped and grey, warned Mr. Merrick that the ground there remembers things, but frontier life seldom allowed the luxury of superstition. Land was land, and the Merricks needed it. According to later testimony from a local clerk, Elias Boone, the Merricks' arrival seemed to lift the gloom around the valley, at least for a time. Smoke rose from the chimney again, children's laughter carried across the ridge, and for a few months it appeared the Gresham fold had been reclaimed by life. But then small disturbances began to return. Mrs. Merrick reported hearing footsteps in the hallway late at night, though her husband was asleep beside her. Doors would stand open in the morning that she swore had been latched tight. One of the children, 7-year-old Clara, named coincidentally like the vanished sister, claimed she had spoken with the quiet lady in grey near the well. When asked what the woman said, Clara replied, "She told me not to eat alone." By midsummer, livestock began disappearing. A single sheep found near the woods had been cleanly butchered, bones stripped and left arranged in a neat circle. Mr. Merrick went into town for supplies and did not return for 3 days. When he did, he seemed disoriented, insisting he'd only been gone one night. Records from the county clerk's log mention a domestic dispute at the Gresham property that July, though no charges were ever filed. Shortly after, the family left without notice. Their wagon was found on the main road, loaded with household goods abandoned. Inside the house, everything remained in place. The bed linens turned down, the hearth swept clean. It was during this same summer that the Springfield Republic once again published a column, this time quoting a professor from the state college who referenced the Ozarks. As a region still haunted by the unexplained, the Kifoi journalist drew a line between the Gresham disappearances and the region's reputation for isolation and secrecy. Even decades later, scholars citing the Ozarks region's sociological records would echo those same themes, the blurred edge between solitude and silence. After the Merrick's departure, county officials ordered the house boarded. Reverend Lyle, now an old man, performed a final blessing over the property, writing afterward in his journal, "The walls hold neither guilt nor grace, only the residue of intent. If the sisters were wicked, they did not act alone." By the time winter settled over the Ozark Hills in 1882, the Gresham fold had become more relic than dwelling. The roof sagged under snow and the shutters hung crooked, yet the stories surrounding it only thickened with the cold. Locals said the snow near the property never held animal tracks for long. Prints appeared, then vanished as though brushed away from beneath. In early January, a group of log haulers from Miller's Crossing took a shortcut past the old house. Among them was James Weatherby, who later gave testimony to the county register after one of his men failed to return. Weatherby described hearing a soft melody drifting from inside the house, a woman's voice humming something faintly hymn-like. Believing it might be squatters or travelers seeking shelter, they approached. The door was closed, but a light flickered through the cracks. When Weatherby pushed it open, the interior was empty, fire long dead, dust thick on the floor. But in one corner, they found the remnants of a meal, cornbread still warm. "We'd been walking near dusk," he said later, "so we thought maybe someone had just stepped out." The men searched the nearby woods, but there were no footprints, only a faint smell of ash and something sour like brine. The missing man, Silas Crane, was never recovered. His name appears on the county roll, noted with a single remark beside it: "Presumed dead. Last seen near the Gresham property." That spring, the county finally dispatched Dr. Edwin Crowley again, at the request of the new sheriff. Crowley was older now, his once steady hands trembling slightly. His report, preserved partially in the Carter County archives, described the structure as unnaturally intact for its age. He observed that the soil behind the house had sunken slightly, as though hollow beneath. When excavation began, the workers uncovered a narrow shaft lined with timber, leading to a small underground space barely large enough for two people to crouch. Inside lay fragments of glass, two rusted utensils, and what appeared to be pieces of a broken mirror. Crowley wrote that the space served neither as root cellar nor storage. Its purpose remains unrecorded, but it was crafted with care. Folklore spread quickly again. Children whispered that the sisters had buried what they couldn't eat, and older folk claimed the Gresham women were seen in dreams by those who came too close. Reverend Lyle, his eyesight failing, penned one last sermon in which he wrote, "The earth does not forget. It holds its own reckonings beneath our plows." In his closing years, Professor Alden North published a final essay on isolation in the Ozarks, referring once more to the Gresham fold as a parable of frontier desolation. He cautioned readers against superstition, yet his tone suggested unease. "In places where the soil breathes fog," he wrote, "memory and myth cannot be cleanly separated." By the end of 1883, the property was struck by lightning and partially burned, leaving only the stone foundation and chimney. Yet, strangely, neighbors swore they still saw lamplight flickering where no walls remained. By 1885, the remains of the Gresham fold had faded into overgrowth. Only the chimney, blackened by the lightning fire, stood as a marker of what once was. Ivy curled around the stones, and the nearby well had caved in, its opening hidden beneath tangled brush. Yet the story of the sisters refused to die. Travelers through the Ozark Hills, surveyors, preachers, and even trappers claimed that the valley seemed wrongly quiet. The birds would not nest near the ruins, and on still mornings, a faint metallic echo could be heard as though from beneath the ground. One traveler, Dr. Byron Ellis, later wrote in his field diary, "I lingered near the fold for less than an hour. The silence was heavy, unnatural, and I swear I heard two voices humming beneath the wind, low as prayer." Dr. Ellis's notes were included in a small pamphlet distributed by the State University in 1886, referencing his study of acoustic phenomena in limestone valleys. In it, He paraphrased an earlier historian of the Ozarks, observing how the region's cavernous terrain often distorted sound and gave rise to folklore. But the local residents refused any natural explanation. To them, the noises came not from stone, but from something left unfinished. That same year, a prospector named Henry Cobb purchased rights to the surrounding land, unaware of its reputation. He intended to reopen an old iron pit nearby and built a small shack for lodging. According to a brief mention in the Springfield Republic that autumn, Cobb left the area within 2 months. His abandoned claim papers bore a smudged note in the margin, "Voices by the well." One kept saying my name. After Cobb's flight, the land reverted again to county custody. The sheriff's office made one last inspection of the site in late 1887, led by Deputy Pelham Jr., son of the man who'd once searched for Marshall Wren. His report is the last official document in the county archive mentioning the fold. He described the foundation as overgrown but stable, with residual heat detected in the soil despite cold weather. The discovery of charred remains, animal or human, uncertain, was logged but never pursued. The legend by then had become a part of local cautionary tales. Parents warned children not to wander near the hollow. Travelers passing through the Ozarks told of the women who fed strangers and vanished into their own stories. The Gresham sisters had become both symbol and superstition, a mirror of the loneliness that clung to these hills. One of the last mentions came in a university circular in 1889, which referenced the case indirectly, while summarizing fieldwork about cultural isolation in the Ozarks. The author, unknowingly echoing the first reference decades earlier, wrote that in every hollow where roads end, the past lies shallow beneath the soil. And so, while the Gresham fold had vanished from sight, its name lingered, half memory, half warning. Those who dared to walk the old trail after sunset often said the same thing. The forest seemed to breathe differently there, as though waiting. By 1890, nearly 20 years since the disappearance of the Gresham sisters, the Ozark Hills had begun to modernize, at least in the nearby towns. Rail lines crept closer to the valleys, bringing merchants, surveyors, and schoolteachers. Yet in that particular hollow where the fold once stood, progress seemed to halt. Roads stopped short. Horses refused to pull wagons past the turn. In a letter from Sheriff Amos Tilbury to the Carter County Registrar that year, he described a recurring issue: trespassers drawn to the old Gresham property. "Young men go up there on wages," he wrote, "and come down pale as if they've seen a funeral." Tilbury requested that the county post signage forbidding entry, but the clerk noted none were ever made. Each time a board was nailed to a tree, it vanished within days. That same spring, a schoolteacher named Sarah Finn began collecting oral stories from her students' families for a regional history project. Her notebook, later discovered in a box of local archives, offers one of the few first-hand glimpses into how the Gresham story survived. One entry reads, "The elder folks say the sisters never left, that when the fire took the house it burned everything but their welcome. They say if you smell baked bread in the woods, don't look for its source." Sarah also recorded a curious pattern. Children who lived within a few miles of the fold often reported dreams of women offering them food. None of the families ever connected these dreams to the sisters directly, but the descriptions were eerily similar. One tall, one short, both pale and smiling too long. In 1892, during a particularly dry summer, a fire swept through parts of the Ozark woodlands. Several homesteads were lost, yet when the flames reached the Gresham Hollow they split apart, as though diverted by the wind, and rejoined beyond it. Locals took it as a sign. Reverend Caleb Rowe, a successor to Lyle's circuit, noted in his diary, "The fold stands no longer in timber or stone, but something unseen guards its ground." During this same period, scholars once again cited the region in passing. A brief paper published in 1893 on folkloric geography of the Ozarks mentioned the persistent tales of the Gresham Hollow, linking it to the lingering social isolation of upland settlers after the war. The writer called it a story stitched into the soil. One autumn evening, a pair of trappers, names unrecorded, claimed to have seen two figures moving through the mist near the old foundation. They were described as women in work dresses, hands clasped, faces blank. The trappers fired warning shots, but when the smoke cleared, Nothing remained but disturbed leaves and the faint scent of baked cornmeal. By the end of 1895, the hollow was once again reclaimed by silence. No families settled there again, and the county eventually struck the land from the public register, marking it only as uninhabitable terrain. Yet those who travelled close swore they heard faint humming rising with the morning fog. Two voices, soft and unhurried, as though still serving a meal long forgotten. By 1896, a generation had passed since the first disappearances, yet the Gresham fold remained fixed in local speech, a story too persistent to die. The hollow itself had become a landmark, spoken of with the same wary tone as old battlegrounds or cursed mines. Travellers to the Ozark Hills sometimes came seeking it deliberately, armed with notebooks and sketchpads, hoping to trace the line between truth and folklore. One of them, Professor Julian Harcourt of the Missouri Normal School, visited that year to compile oral accounts for a study on rural superstition. His journal survives in fragments and provides a rare outsider's view. He described the Ozark terrain, thick woods, limestone outcrops, and mist rising from unseen springs, remarking how every sound seems doubled, like the land itself echoes with unfinished memory. That phrasing, lifted from his field report, was later quoted in a university bulletin summarizing cultural studies of the Ozarks. Harcourt's entries on the Gresham Hollow are brief but vivid. On June 3rd, he wrote, "Locals refused to guide me beyond the ridge. Even the dogs would not follow. The air beyond feels colder, though the sun is bright. I saw or thought I saw two figures near the stone chimney, but when I approached, there was nothing but light shimmering on the ground." He also noted the peculiar stillness of the area. Birds did not sing there, and even the wind seemed to hesitate. He left offerings, a crust of bread, a copper coin on the chimney's ledge, to test the superstition. When he returned at dawn, both were gone, yet no footprints marked the soil. His final comment reads simply, "The meal was accepted." Later that summer, Harcourt fell ill while traveling back to Springfield. He complained of vivid dreams in which he was seated at a table laid with steaming food, yet he could never recall the taste upon waking. His death later that year was attributed to fever, though local gossip claimed otherwise. The following winter, a brief article appeared in the Springfield Republic, titled "Echoes in the Ozarks." It recounted Harcourt's notes and linked his death to the persistent legend of the Gresham women. For a short time, the paper revived public curiosity, prompting several letters from readers claiming ancestral ties to the case. One correspondent even asserted that her grandmother had once worked as a maid for the sisters and fled after finding bones under the hearth. The claim was never verified, yet it added another layer to the fold's expanding mythos. By the end of the century, the Gresham legend had transformed from a documented mystery into oral heritage. It was told beside campfires and in schoolhouses, shifting subtly with each retelling. But one constant remained, the warning that hospitality in those hills came at a price. As the 19th century drew to a close, the Ozark Hollow lay untouched, overgrown, unnamed on maps, yet still whispered about in taverns and on porches. And when travelers passed that stretch of road at dusk, some swore they smelled bread baking where no home stood, as though the past still cooked for those who dared to remember it. The turn of the century brought with it a new kind of curiosity, less superstition, more scholarship. By 1901, the Ozark Hills had drawn attention from amateur historians and folklorists who sought to catalogue rural legends before they faded with time. Among these researchers was Dr. Eleanor Hatch, one of the few women publishing field reports in the region. Her work, Folklore and Frontier Memory in the Ozarks, included a small but striking section on the Gresham Hollow. Dr. Hatch visited the area in 1902, guided by a local farmer who refused to step closer than half a mile to the site. In her notes, she paraphrased earlier geographical observations about the Ozarks, noting that its uneven terrain and deep valleys often gave rise to stories rooted in isolation as much as fear. Yet even she admitted the fold held a different weight. "The ruin sits upon a gentle slope," she wrote, "but the ground feels wrong underfoot, as if hollow or breathing. No birds, no crickets, only stillness. It is not a silence of peace, but of pause." Hatch recorded interviews with 3 elderly residents who claimed family ties to the events of the 1870s. One, Mrs. Ada Lyle, granddaughter of the old Reverend, recalled her father describing singing that came before storms. Another insisted that bones once found behind the property had been reburied quietly in the churchyard, to give them names again. None of these statements could be verified, but Hatch's report gave the story renewed life. Around this same time, a local newspaper editor, Frank Della, republished the earlier articles from the Springfield Republic, combining them into a feature called The Sisters of the Fold. The story ran serially across 3 Sundays and became something of a regional sensation. Though Della insisted his work was factual, many of his descriptions leaned into Gothic embellishment. The women's laughter echoed down the valley like spoons against iron. The series spurred visitors to the Hollow, curiosity seekers, amateur mediums and self-styled ghost hunters. Local law enforcement soon declared the area off-limits, claiming the terrain was unsafe due to sinkholes. Yet rumors persisted that late-night wanderers could still see 2 faint shapes moving among the ashes. Dr. Hatch returned to Springfield that winter to compile her findings, but tragedy followed. Her assistant, Lydia Barnes, was found drowned in a shallow creek not far from the Gresham site. Hatch's diary makes brief mention of the event. She went alone to photograph the chimney. I told her to wait until morning. The photographs, if they ever existed, were never recovered. In later correspondence, Hatch referred to the Gresham case as an emblem of the Ozark's uneasy balance between truth and terror. Her phrasing, echoed decades later by cultural historians, marked one of the last academic references to the fold within the period's 50-year boundary. By the end of 1905, the Hollow had once again vanished into quiet, its story waiting like breath held beneath the soil. In 1906, the old Gresham Hollow was little more than a tangle of oaks and brambles. The last marked path to it had long since been reclaimed by vines, yet the story still traveled by word of mouth, like something that refused to die properly. The Ozark Hills were changing, yes, roads being widened, telegraph poles marching north. But in that one valley, the modern world seemed to stop at its edge. That year, a small religious sect, calling themselves the Sanctified Pilgrims, arrived from Tennessee, claiming divine instruction to redeem the fold. Led by a self-proclaimed minister named Josiah Penley, they camped for several weeks near the old site, building makeshift altars from limestone and chanting hymns into the fog. Their presence unsettled nearby farmers, who reported sleepless nights filled with strange harmonies, rising and falling like women's voices in mourning. A report from Carter County Sheriff's Office, dated July 14, 1906, describes a night disturbance, smoke seen over the hollow, followed by screams and a great trembling underfoot. When deputies arrived at dawn, the camp was deserted. No bodies, no wagons. Only scorched ground and a single book left behind, its pages soaked but legible. The title read The Book of Reckonings. Inside, the first few entries were sermons about repentance, but later pages became frantic, drawings of a house, a table, and 2 figures seated at it. One passage read, "They offered bread and I accepted. Now I must listen." The journal was later placed in the county archive, though over the years several pages went missing. The event reignited local fear. Old residents whispered that the pilgrims had been taken by the same welcome as those before. Even Reverend Rowe, who had long dismissed superstition, noted in his diary, "If wickedness still lingers in that place, it has learned patience beyond human years." That winter, a young journalist named Clifford Marsh visited the area to write a story for the St. Louis Dispatch. His article, "The Hollow That Will Not Sleep," painted the legend with chilling restraint. Marsh wrote that he found a stone hearth with ashes still soft to the touch, though it had not burned in years. He also claimed that faint outlines of footprints, bare and small, circled the ruins, though he could not say how recent. He concluded his article with a line that still appears in reprints of regional lore anthologies. In the Ozark Hills, the line between hospitality and hunger remains thin as dust. Within months of publishing the piece, Marsh fell gravely ill during another assignment in Arkansas. His editor later described his final delirium. The reporter muttered about 2 women waiting at a table and how the bread never cools. By 1907, no one dared live within a mile of the hollow. The legend had become so entrenched that even land surveyors refused contracts to chart the terrain. The maps of that region simply left a blank gap, a nameless valley between ridges, a silence that history itself seemed to maintain. By 1908, the hollow had achieved a kind of notoriety that stretched beyond Missouri. The Kansas City Star ran a feature titled "The Sisters' Table, Ozark Mystery Endures," summarizing 50 years of rumor and record. The writer, Helen Moorfield, pieced together earlier accounts from the Springfield Republic and Professor Alden North's essays on the Ozarks, noting how isolation and superstition often blurred into one another. Her conclusion was measured but grim. What began as folklore has calcified into warning. Locally, however, the tale had taken a darker turn. Children dared each other to bring a piece of bread to the edge of the old Gresham land and leave it overnight. According to oral reports later gathered by County Librarian Matilda Crane, every loaf left there was gone by morning, but not a single crumb nor footprint was found. In late summer of 1908, a road crew expanding the route between Loring's Pass and Reed's Hollow accidentally unearthed what appeared to be fragments of a cellar foundation, square-cut stones, and a rusted cooking pot. Foreman Arthur Bell filed the discovery, but noted that his men refused to continue digging after hearing what they described as soft knocks beneath the soil. The project was quietly rerouted, and no official record of the alternate path was kept. Later that autumn, Dr. Eleanor Hatch, now elderly and nearly blind, revisited the area accompanied by two younger scholars. Her notes, preserved in the State University's folklore collection, mention that she felt the same stillness as 30 years prior. This time, however, she added an unsettling detail. There is a sound, not wind, not water, but something rhythmic, like breath. I felt it through the soles of my boots. She also wrote that one of her companions, Mr. Doran, reported hearing faint humming near the collapsed well. When they turned to look, they saw nothing, yet the air felt denser, warmer, as though the sun had touched the ground. The group left before dusk, leaving their measuring tools behind. None ever returned to collect them. By 1909, Dr. Hatch had passed away in Springfield. Her final letter to a colleague described her enduring fascination with the Gresham legend, but ended abruptly with a chilling reflection. Hospitality is a mirror. Sometimes, when we accept it, something else looks back. After her death, her surviving papers reignited interest among students of regional folklore, who reprinted excerpts from her early work alongside contemporary theories of spiritualism and psychological suggestion. Yet none could quite dispel the sense that the Fold story remained unfinished. That winter, a blizzard swept across the Ozarks, burying the hollow entirely. For months it vanished beneath snowdrifts and silence. When spring came, a passing traveler wrote that the ground where the house had once stood appeared freshly turned, as if something had stirred beneath. Even in the dawn of a new century, when electricity reached nearby towns and the telegraph carried faster truths, the Gresham Fold remained untouched by reason, its story preserved in whispers, its soil restless under time. The decade that followed brought the slow hum of modernity to the Ozark Hills, post offices, rail lines, and small-town newspapers spreading outward, but none of it seemed to reach the Gresham Hollow. By 1910, maps labeled the valley simply as abandoned tract, and even that felt generous. The name Gresham had vanished from official use, though old-timers still muttered it when fires burned too low or storms rose without warning. That same year, Professor Lionel Cartwright, a historian from St. Louis, conducted what would become the last formal survey of the area. His purpose was academic, to compile a record of folk mysteries for a series titled Haunted Geographies of the American Frontier. Cartwright had read the writings of Alden North, Dr. Hatch, and even the brief cultural summaries of the Ozarks region that had described its terrain as beautiful, deceptive, and filled with silences. He arrived in Carter County in late April, with 2 graduate assistants and a pack mule loaded with surveying gear. Their journals describe a long, unsettling journey. The path to the hollow was overgrown but still faintly marked by old stones, perhaps remnants of the original Gresham foundation. The first night they camped nearby, one assistant, Peter Lowell, noted in his diary, "The woods are so still that even our fire makes too much noise. Around midnight I thought I heard women's laughter, soft and steady, coming from the trees." Cartwright's own notes were analytical at first. He documented the soil, the structure of the ruins, and the strange thermal readings his instruments detected. warmer underground than above, despite cool weather. Yet as the days went on, his entries grew more erratic. One undated page reads simply, "Something is listening back." A week later, Cartwright's second assistant, Evan Morse, returned alone to Loring's Pass, terrified and disoriented. His account, taken by local authorities, described how the professor had gone into the hollow at night to record the singing. Morse waited at camp but heard nothing until just before dawn, when he saw two figures, women in dark dresses, walking away from the fire toward the ruins. Cartwright followed, carrying a lantern. Neither he nor Lowell returned. A search party recovered only the broken lens of a camera and a tin plate with burned edges. The film inside was ruined by heat, but one strip appeared to show a faint outline of a table set with plates. Sheriff Tilbury's report closed the investigation with the remark, "Area unsafe for further entry." For years after, Cartwright's disappearance was cited in journals as a cautionary tale about the perils of fieldwork in superstitious country. Yet in Carter County, the story became something else, a renewal of the Fold's old curse. Residents once again avoided the valley, calling it the hollow that feeds itself. And so, as the century edged onward, progress passed the place by. Roads bent around it, telegraph lines skipped over it, and the forest crept closer each year, as though nature itself had agreed to seal the story in silence. By 1912, the Gresham Hollow had become less a place than an inheritance of fear, a quiet story every child in the southern Ozarks learned, whether they believed it or not. The name appeared occasionally in old sermons or in the margins of estate maps where boundaries faded into forest, but still no one went there. That spring, however, a group of railroad surveyors, unaware of the land's reputation, began planning a line that would cut across the old hollow. Their supervisor, Charles Dunning, recorded in his log that the terrain appeared ideal, flat, open and dry. On their second week of work, they set up camp near the remains of the old Gresham chimney, which they mistook for an old settler's hearth. 2 nights later, Dunning reported hearing low voices, not of the men, not of echo. The next morning, his crew found 3 sets of boot prints circling the chimney, 2 small, 1 large, but the ground beyond was untouched. One worker, John Matthews, refused to stay another night, claiming he'd seen lamplight moving under the soil. The team withdrew, rerouting the line north. But that incident left behind a curious piece of evidence, a single photograph, taken by Dunning's apprentice before dawn. Though grainy and poorly exposed, it clearly showed the hearth and a faint glow behind it, like coals still burning, though none of the men had lit a fire. The image was sent to the Springfield Republic, where it ran beneath the headline, "Is the Fold Still Alive?" The article reignited public fascination. Readers from across the state wrote in with theories, some invoking science, others the supernatural. But for residents of Carter County, the renewed attention brought only unease. The sheriff's office once again fenced off the land, declaring it unsafe due to ground instability. That summer, storms battered the Ozark Hills. One night in August, lightning struck the ridge above the hollow, and for hours afterward, travelers on the nearby road swore they saw 2 lights flickering in the fog, weaving like lanterns carried by unseen hands. A farmer named Caleb Norris, who lived within sight of the valley, wrote to the county clerk, "I don't much believe in ghosts, but that night the air itself felt heavy, like breath pressing against the window panes." Meanwhile, academics continued to reference the case from afar. In a 1913 lecture on rural isolation, a professor paraphrased earlier Ozark studies, describing how places of silence retain memory long after their builders are gone. He cited the Gresham Hollow only briefly, but his words carried the weight of inevitability. By the end of that year, floodwaters had washed out the trail leading into the hollow, sealing it off completely. Locals said it was nature's mercy, the land closing its mouth. Yet on cold mornings, Norris and others swore they still saw thin columns of smoke rising from where the chimney once stood, curling upward like the last breath of a story refusing to end. By 1914, the Gresham Hollow had settled into uneasy obscurity. The world beyond the Ozarks was changing. Trains shrieked across bridges, telegrams flew faster than the wind. But in Carter County, the hollow remained a place of whispers. Those who lived near it spoke cautiously, as if the story could still hear its own name. That spring, a traveling photographer named Nathaniel Keene arrived from St. Louis, hoping to document forgotten corners of frontier life. He'd read about the fold in old newspaper clippings, including the Springfield Republic's eerie coverage of the 1870s disappearances and the later, haunted geography reports. To him, the hollow was the perfect subject, mystery with roots, in fact. Keene set up camp along the ridge and took several photographs of the ruins. His diary, later found among his belongings, describes his fascination. It is nothing but stone and vine, yet the air feels dense, as if it resists the lens. The silence has a pulse to it. On his third day, Keene ventured deeper toward the heart of the site. He wrote that he discovered remnants of a stone path lined with wild herbs, leading to what might once have been a garden. There, amid moss and broken crockery, he found a rusted tin plate engraved faintly with two initials, M.G. Whether this referred to Mabel Gresham or someone else, no one could say. That night, he camped within sight of the chimney. His final entry, dated May 19th, reads only, "They were kind. They asked if I'd eaten." Keene never returned to St. Louis. When a postal courier discovered his abandoned wagon 2 weeks later, the camera was missing, and his campsite appeared undisturbed, save for 2 tin cups set neatly on the ground beside a cold fire. The county listed him as lost to wilderness. In the years that followed, a few of his surviving photographs surfaced in antique shops. One image, reportedly taken near the fold, shows the faint outline of 2 figures standing at a table, blurred and nearly transparent. Though most experts dismiss it as a damaged exposure, the picture became part of local legend, often displayed at roadside inns as a warning not to wander after dusk. Meanwhile, references to the Ozarks in early 20th century travel journals began to shift. What had once been described as a rugged and scenic frontier gained new associations with hauntings, disappearances, and places where the soil keeps secrets. The Gresham Hollow, unnamed in most of these accounts, lingered like a ghost within geography itself. By 1915, the forest had reclaimed nearly everything. The chimney had fallen. The well was a pit of weeds, and even the birds avoided nesting in its trees. Only one thing seemed to remain unchanged. Those who walked too close swore they heard the faint clatter of dishes, as if a meal was being served in a house no longer there. By 1916, the Gresham Hollow had nearly vanished beneath moss and thyme. Yet curiously, its absence made it more powerful. Stories of the sisters had evolved from a cautionary legend into something almost ceremonial. A tale told by lamplight, with bread passed around the table before the telling began. Few realized how deeply the story had shaped the region's culture. That spring, Dr. Samuel Pryor, a folklorist from Little Rock, visited Carter County to document disappearing oral traditions of the Ozarks. His notes, preserved in the state archives, include several pages dedicated to the Gresham tale. He interviewed more than a dozen locals, each offering a slightly different version. But one detail remained constant. The sisters were said to have offered food to travelers that filled the belly but stole the soul. Pryor's journal reflected a tension between skepticism and fascination. Early entries cite his awareness of prior studies, Alden North's observations on frontier isolation, and Dr. Hatch's field notes about the fold's silence. But by the midpoint of his stay, his tone changed. He wrote, "I have read much about the Ozarks being a place of echoes, but I begin to wonder if some echoes listen back." He also referenced a chilling discovery, a fragment of ceramic pottery unearthed near the old chimney. It bore traces of soot and an engraved symbol, 2 crossed spoons. The artifact was boxed and sent to the local courthouse for cataloguing, but before it could be examined, the box went missing. Pryor stayed in the region until early summer. According to his last correspondence with a colleague, he had decided to spend one final night near the hollow to make sound recordings on wax cylinders. That letter ends with a single line, "If the hills truly sing, I will bring their song home." The cylinders were later recovered, warped by heat. Only one remained partially intact. When played, it produced faint static, and beneath it, something like rhythmic tapping, steady, deliberate, almost like cutlery against a plate. The discovery caused a brief stir in academic circles. A short paper published in 1917 referenced Pryor's work as an intersection of myth and environment. The author paraphrased earlier Ozark studies, noting how landscapes dense with silence become receptacles of the human imagination. But in Carter County, no one needed theory. They had lived beside that silence for generations. By the end of 1917, the Gresham Hollow was once again buried under seasonal growth. The road that once led to it became impassable, swallowed by rain and roots. Yet locals said the air there still felt warmer than it should, and that sometimes in the hush between day and dusk, you could smell cornbread baking where no fire burned. The county's ledgers closed the file that year, marking the area as natural reserve, no habitation. But in the evenings, when the wind rolled through the Ozark valleys, some swore they could still hear the faint hum of two women singing, patient and unbroken, as if serving a meal that had never truly ended. By 1918, the First World War had begun to pull young men from the Ozarks toward Europe, and the hollows that once echoed with gossip fell quiet. The Gresham legend, however, persisted in smaller circles, passed down in kitchens and porches, spoken half in jest, half in warning. For the people who remained in Carter County, it wasn't merely a ghost story. It was geography woven with memory. That winter, Reverend Amos Hale, newly assigned to the parish at Loring's Pass, took interest in the tale after discovering fragments of Dr. Pryor's fieldwork stored in the church's annex. Hale's own diary, now kept in the state's historical library, reveals his determination to redeem the cursed hollow. In February, accompanied by two parishioners, he ventured to the overgrown trail that once led to the Gresham property. They found almost nothing, no chimney, no well, not even stones marking the old foundation. Only a shallow depression in the earth remained, ringed with wild mint. Yet Hale wrote that as they stood there, the air seemed to vibrate faintly, as if a low hum rose from the ground itself. One of the men, Silas Boone, claimed he smelled fresh bread. The other, Eli Carter, refused to speak afterward. Hale described what followed in a trembling hand. The sound grew clearer, two tones weaving like a hymn without words. The earth beneath us quivered, and I knew as surely as faith itself that the fold had not left but merely sunken deeper. The men fled, but Reverend Hale returned the next morning alone. His horse came back at dusk without him. Days later, searchers found his Bible near the creek, open to a page from Psalms. "Thou preparest a table before me." No trace of Hale himself was ever recovered. The incident reignited local fear, though newspapers gave it only a passing mention, overshadowed by war coverage. Yet among the townsfolk, the story became a kind of whispered prayer, "Don't follow the song." Later that year, a small academic bulletin reprinted a section of Alden North's earlier writings on the Ozarks, quoting his observation that some valleys resist the passing of time, holding the shape of old tragedies like fossils. The editor appended a brief note referencing the so-called Gresham Fold, as though reluctant to name it outright. By 1919, the hollow was considered cursed ground once more. Travelers avoided it. Even hunters skirted its edge. When the county attempted to survey the area for timber rights, the crew reported their compasses spinning uselessly near the boundary, as if disoriented by unseen force. That winter, snow blanketed the Ozark ridges in white silence. Locals said it covered the hollow completely, so perfectly that it seemed the ground had never been disturbed. But one man, returning from Loring's Pass at dusk, swore he saw faint indentations in the snow. Two sets of footprints walking side by side, vanishing into the fog as if on their way to serve supper once again. By 1920, the Gresham Hollow had become a whisper sealed within the earth. A half-century had passed since the first traveler vanished at the sisters' table, and yet their story lingered, like smoke that refused to clear. The Ozark Hills had changed. Roads were paved, telegraph poles rose like wooden crosses, and electricity glimmered in towns that once slept by candlelight. But in that one narrow valley, the pass seemed unwilling to surrender. A final mention appeared that spring in the Springfield Republic, commemorating 50 years since the Gresham vanishings. The article revisited the events with cautious detachment, citing county ledgers, Reverend Hale's notes, and fragments of Dr. Hatch's writings. The journalist paraphrased the Ozarks entry from the encyclopedic records of the time, observing how the region's rugged isolation nurtured both endurance and fear. It was meant as cultural reflection, but for locals, It sounded like prophecy. Shortly after the article's publication, a small expedition organized by Professor Miriam Wade of the University of Arkansas attempted to revisit the site. They found no path, only thickets and limestone ridges, and when they finally reached the coordinates recorded in 1871, they discovered a shallow depression overgrown with mint and moss. There was no trace of the chimney, the well, or the cellar, but Wade's assistant, Robert Clines, later claimed that as dusk settled, he heard a faint clinking like utensils against a plate, echoing beneath the soil. Her field notes from that day end abruptly. The air is too still. Even our breath feels borrowed. If the fold was ever here, it remains unseen, patient as hunger. That sentence became the last recorded observation of the site. Soon after, the land was absorbed into a conservation boundary, its name removed from all official maps. The Gresham Hollow no longer existed in any tangible sense, only in the collective memory of a region where silence carries weight. Yet the legend refused to fade. Locals told of hikers who lost their way and returned speaking of a house with lights, or hunters who smelled bread baking when the woods were cold. Each generation retold the tale slightly differently, but always with the same ending: two women, calm and kind, offering food no one should accept. By the close of that decade, when the last of those who remembered the sisters had passed on, the fold's name became less a story and more a sensation, something felt rather than spoken. Even now, those who walk the old ridge trails say there's a point where the forest falls utterly still, where the air grows warm and a quiet hum seems to rise from nowhere. And if one lingers too long, they say, the scent of cornbread drifts through the trees, soft, inviting, and wrong. Because in the Ozark Hills, the Gresham fold was never truly gone. It only learned to wait,